welcome everyone. We're waiting on food, so what we'll do is get started here, and then take a break when the food comes in, so everyone can get settled. So thanks for your patience with that. Thank you for your patience. All right, so it's my privilege today to introduce Kevin Connors as our speaker. Mr. Connors is Assistant Director for Regulatory Compliance and Energy Policy at the Energy and Environmental Research Center, where he works with a multidisciplinary team of scientists, engineers, and business professionals to integrate legal and regulatory policy, economics, and tax perspectives with applied research related to incremental oil recovery, unconventional oil recovery, and CO2 capture and geologic storage. He currently serves as the program manager for the Plains CO2 Reduction or PCOR partnership, and that's focused on addressing regional capture, transport, use, and storage challenges facing commercial CCUS deployment. Mr. Connors holds a bachelor's degree in geology from the University of Montana. And prior to his work at the EERC, he held several positions with the North Dakota Industrial Commission's Oil and Gas Division, including CCS Supervisor, Pipeline Program Supervisor, and Underground Injection Control Supervisor, and Petroleum Engineer. He began his career as a well site geologist in the oil fields of Western North Dakota. So the School of Energy Resources is partnered with Mr. Connors and his team at the EERC on the PCOR Partnership Initiative, and we're very much looking forward to continuing all the interesting projects we have going on. So thank you. We're really glad you made it. And it looks like now the food is here. So with that introduction, we'll go ahead and get food and then pass it over to you if that works.
Okay.
Okay.
These ones are vegetarian and then
All right, get our food.
I'll grab you, or you can, there's going to be plenty more.
Yeah, I'll wait.
So,
Yeah, she got it.
She's got you.
Try to eat it while I talk. That'll be nice.
There you go. Take bite.
Montana prison.
Oh, yeah.
I have some family who went to Montana and
Okay.
I had a prison hat. So that was my favorite. So I mean, that's close to where I was.
Okay. Yeah, we love Montana. Me and my wife up there. Good to get started here.
I think we're settled. Take it away, Kevin.
Okay, well, I'm really glad to be here today in beautiful Wyoming. It's a pleasure to be here with these folks at the School of Energy Resources, the Energy and Environmental Research Center. I'll explain a little bit who we are, and then talk a little bit about a research program that we partnered with the School of Energy Resources on called the PCOR Partnership, or the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership. We'll talk about the state vision North Dakota has for carbon management and how we really align with Wyoming. That's why I'm here, because North Dakota and Wyoming, I'm gonna try to draw a lot of we have a lot in common in the direction we want to go with carbon capture and storage between our two states. We'll talk about geology, which is one of my favorite subjects, and engineering, wellbore design for CO2 storage. Talk about today's incentive programs that are driving CCES. Some of the policies and regulations, kind of that we're able to tie the engineering and the geology together through the policy and regulatory frameworks, and the importance of permitting these projects as we move toward deployment. I'll talk about that, and then at the end we'll talk about the incentive-driven CCS projects, that the first wave of projects we see in North Dakota, and I believe Wyoming as well. Just a little bit of background on myself. I have a geology degree. I was hoping I'd see some geology students here today. Anyone? All right, great. And so I studied geology at the University of Montana. Just as I was graduating, my wife and I met there and got married when we were in college. And then she got pregnant that March our senior year. And so we had a little baby right after I graduated. And right at that time is when the Bakken play started taking off. And so got a great opportunity to go from getting my college degree in geology to go do well site geology work in the oil fields of Western Montana. And it was a great opportunity to go work for the oil and gas industry. In that time, when I was doing my geology studies at the University of Montana, I was in the Rocky Mountains mapping geologic units, and I thought that I was going to do that for the rest of my life, right? But then it came time to graduate and get a job, and that's where the oil and gas industry provided me that opportunity, and it was because I had that geology degree. So I just want to encourage all the students in here to just keep going at it. That degree is so important for moving into the next step of your life. But as I worked in the oil industry, I was doing well site work. I was gone for 30 days at a time, living on an oil rig, and it wasn't what my wife and I envisioned when we got married in college. We envisioned being together, and so we hit kind of a crossroads in life where we had to make a decision. And at that time, we were given the opportunity to go work for the state of North Dakota. And we moved to Williston, North Dakota, in the height of the boom. And we were together every day as a family. It's all that mattered to us. And that's where I took a job as a petroleum engineer for the state of North Dakota as a field inspector. And I was going around, I was spending all day in the field, chasing rigs around and making sure the wells were constructed properly, investigating or inspecting oil production sites, injection well sites. And then within about a year of that, the state created a new position in 2011 called Carbon Capture and Storage Supervisor. And I was given that opportunity. We moved down to Bismarck, and that time I was, the goal of that position was to apply to the federal government, to EPA, for Class 6 primacy, which is the regulatory authority for the state to regulate CO2 storage activities within the state of North Dakota. So just want to point that out to the students. I went from having a geology degree to working in the oil and gas industry to petroleum engineer. All of a sudden, I was in Bismarck writing regulatory policy and writing regulatory frameworks and developing the first of its kind for the state of North Dakota. I had great mentorship there, which was key, and we were able to successfully do what we set out to do in North Dakota. It took 5 years, but that was a delay on the federal government's part. In that time, I worked for the state of North Dakota in the oil and gas regulatory side of things for 8 years. When I wasn't developing the CO2 storage program, I administered our Class 2 UIC program. When I say UIC, I mean Underground Injection Control Program. These are derived from the Safe Drinking Water Act. And Class 2 wells are injection wells that in place fluids that are associated with oil and gas activities. So saltwater disposal wells, where there's a waste product that's come to the surface when you produce oil, and we're disposing of that salt water properly in geologic formations, and then injection for enhanced oil recovery. So I administered the North Dakota program for a few years, issued over 100 permits in that place. During that time. And then North Dakota had this, during the, we were still having a lot of oil and gas activity, obviously. We were growing in our production. We were experiencing some issues with our pipelines in our state, where we were having like undetected leaks of oil or gas, or actually of salt water in our pipelines. And these were previously unregulated pipelines. And so they asked me to come in. I created a regulatory program for these previously unregulated pipelines in North Dakota. And so again, my experience was geology, petroleum engineering, underground injection control, regulatory frameworks, and now pipelines as well. And so about 2.5, 3 years ago, I transitioned over to the Energy and Environmental Research Center, where I'm the assistant director for regulatory compliance, energy policy, but I also get to manage the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership, which is it's a regional partnership, it's a regional consortium where we're partnered with the School of Energy Resources, and we're looking at accelerating CCUS deployments. We'll talk about that. So who is the EERC? We have this ambitious goal to lead the world in developing solutions to energy and environmental challenges. I love this ambitious goal. It's something that I remind myself of this on sometimes weekly or daily basis. But the way the EERC operates is we operate on, we're most successful with our partners. So we have industry partners, we have other institutional partners, we have government partners, and our partnership with, like, for instance, the School of Energy Resources here is so important for us to be able to shoot for this vision and this mission as an organization. So I feel like we do this with our partners. And now, if you look at North Dakota and Wyoming, I think we can do this together. I think the North Dakota energy and environmental challenges that we see, I think we can work together to solve those. And that's part of the work we're doing. That's part of the reason I'm here today is through that partnership. It's a very important partnership to the EERC, what we have here in Wyoming. So here is the EERC, it's our facility. We're on the eastern edge of the University of North Dakota campus. And you know, we have a long history here. We started in the 1950s as a lignite research lab or national lab from the U.S. Bureau of Mines. And then in the 80s, the Reagan administration defederalized a lot of the national labs, and the EERC was one of them. And that's where we fell under the umbrella of UND. We became we're a non-teaching business unit at UND. But at that time in the 80s, that's where our culture really blossomed. We expanded, we grew in our business. So we still today are, one of our core research priorities is still coal utilization and coal emissions, where we're looking at improving our coal emissions. We're looking at carbon capture. We have expertise in that, but we're also looking at materials made with our abundant lignite coal resource in North Dakota. Another one of our research priorities is carbon management. And that's what I'll be talking about basically for the rest of this discussion today. We do oil and gas research, specifically in North Dakota, but all around the world. And also we do research in the renewable fuels and fuels of the future, and then also the energy water nexus. So that's our core research priorities. But the EERC is really the people. We have about 250 and growing employees with diverse backgrounds, diverse expertise, and we operate as a true team. And like I said, one of our core ways that we do business is through partnerships. We're really successful at leveraging federal research dollars, specifically from the Department of Energy, state research dollars from our state research organizations, and then matching that with private industry dollars, partnering with institutions like the School of Energy Resources. Okay, I'm going to transition here to what we call the Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership Program. This is a long-standing program. We're going on 19 years, and this is just a look at the North American picture where there's four regions, and I'll be talking about the region in green that's managed by the EERC, or the Energy and Environmental Research Center. So here's the P Corps partnership, the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership. Today we've expanded, so we're all the area in green where we have the partnership now includes all of Wyoming, all of Montana, all of British Columbia, and Alaska. That began in 2019 under the current phase we're in, where we partnered with the School of Energy Resources and the Institute of Northern Engineering in University of Alaska Fairbanks. So a really unique partnership that we have advancing carbon capture, utilization, and storage in our greater region. But our states, North Dakota, Wyoming, are really key to that. We're driving it right now with the commercial activity, and we'll get to there. We'll get to that. But we have a long history. We've been doing applied research in carbon capture, utilization, storage for 19 years. Next year will be 20 years. I really look forward to that and celebrating that, because we've made a lot of progress along the way. We started out characterizing our region. We looked for the major stationary sources of CO2, our industrial facilities, our electricity generation units, our cement plants, refineries, gas processing plants, and also ethanol facilities. And then we identified the major geologic sinks, our sedimentary basins in our region, and we kind of performed the sink source matching, where we identified the ideal geologic units to store large volumes of CO2. But in addition to that, we recognized the lack of regulations and policy. And so in order for projects, what we see today, there's a CCUS industry that we see today that is making investment to develop projects. They need the regulatory certainty in place to be able to make those investments. And so states like North Dakota and Wyoming, who have developed those frameworks, are seeing a lot of the activity because there's certainty in our states. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I just want to show the activity from a regional perspective. We have existing CO2 pipelines in Wyoming, and I'm sure most of you or all of you are aware of, that transport CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. That pipeline was actually recently extended into North Dakota, and Denbury Resources began injection for CO2 enhanced oil recovery into North Dakota in the Cedar Hills unit. And then in the North Dakota region, we have an existing pipeline that's been there for 20 years at the what we call on this here, the Great Plains Synfuel plant. That's a plant that takes our lignite coal research and it makes gas out of it. And then there's a CO2 stream that's captured. It's been piped up to the Weyburn oil fields in Saskatchewan for over 20 years now. So we have existing infrastructure, but what you're probably seeing here is the spaghetti mess on the screen. And this is a really exciting thing for us in the CCUS world. We're seeing private investment to capture the CO2 from the major sources in Iowa, eastern Nebraska, eastern South Dakota, southern Minnesota, and eastern North Dakota, and build out that infrastructure and transport it to the appropriate basins, where you have the Williston Basin, you have the Powder River Basin, you have the Illinois Basin to the east. So I'll be talking a little bit more about these projects. I'm not going to spend much more time on this. Let's switch gears here a little bit. Let's talk about the future. The future of everything we're looking at today is looking at a carbon-constrained world. Okay, there's a lot of effort to get to carbon neutral by 2030. I added this part of this to the slide here at the bottom here. About a year ago, or less than a year, the North Dakota governor, Governor Burgum, gave a state vision that he wants the state of North Dakota to be carbon neutral by 2030. That's an ambitious goal. The state of North Dakota is, we're just like Wyoming. We're an energy state. We produce more energy than we consume, so we export energy. We have an abundant coal resource. We have an 800-year supply of lignite coal at current consumption. We have major electricity generation units. We have abundant oil and gas industry, and we're an ag state where we're producing the world's food. Okay, so carbon neutral by 2030 is very ambitious, and the way that the governor set that that state vision is it's not going to be through regulation. It's going to be through innovation, technology innovation, and CCUS plays a key role. It's a key tool in that technology innovation that we need to meet that goal. So the way we look at carbon dioxide is we look at it in a way in terms of carbon management. Okay, so we want to be able to maintain robust, reliable, resilient, dispatchable, affordable energy. Okay, we want to be able to do that as we manage our CO2. We don't want to stymie business. We want our businesses to thrive. We want our state energy industries to thrive, and we want to manage the carbon dioxide doing it. Okay, so that's the vision. It's carbon management, and it's thriving industries. It's our electricity generation industry being able to supply clean electricity, low carbon electricity to the 11 other states that we send our electricity to. It's our oil and gas industry producing oil, but at the same time utilizing that carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery. And it's our ag industry, which is abundant in our state, is to be able to do that by offsetting their carbon emissions through our ethanol and other processes as well. So it all starts with geology when we're talking about carbon dioxide storage. Okay, it's all about geology. Here you have a picture of, I'll talk a lot about this, the Broom Creek Formation. This formation lies about a mile or more deep in the Williston Basin, and we're going to dig into that a little bit, but this is an ideal sandstone. It's the primary target for large-scale saline storage in North Dakota in the Williston Basin. Okay, so we're talking about carbon capture storage. We're talking about capturing CO2 off of major stationary facilities and piping that CO2, whether it be right there at the facility to an injection well, or it be across multiple state boundaries to an ideal geologic unit. And we're looking at saline storage or reservoirs that are not oil and gas bearing for storing that CO2 permanently in the subsurface. And we can do this in a safe manner that protects humans and protects the environment, protects our groundwater systems. And that's kind of the goal of, part of the goal today is just to walk you through how we do that. Okay, so we have criteria that we need to meet when we're looking at subsurface storage of carbon dioxide, geologic criteria. There's a certain depth threshold that needs to be met. And we need to be at 2,600 feet or greater. That allows the carbon dioxide molecule to be dense phase. Okay, so we're able to ensure that it stays in a supercritical state. We're also looking at for porosity and permeability and the combination of the two. And I'll talk about that on my next slide. We also look for good cap rock. So we're not only looking for an ideal formation that will accept the CO2, but we're looking for rock layers above and below that will contain the CO2. Looking for the appropriate salinity level. We're looking to inject CO2 into formations with poor water quality that would never be used for human consumption. And I'll talk more about that. And then also looking for natural leakage pathways, and I'd also say artificial leakage pathways. So around these sites, we're looking for any faulting or fracturing that would be transmissive from the upper confining zone into our drinking water. And that would, if we began injection activity, we could drive fluids up into and contaminate our drinking water. We're looking for that. And we're also looking for the artificial penetration. So an old oil and gas well that was drilled maybe in the 50s or 60s that was plugged to the standards of those days, but not to the standards of today, that could act as a leakage pathway. So those are the things we look for to ensure that carbon dioxide is permanently and safely stored in the subsurface. Okay, porosity and permeability. So we're looking for the picture on your right over here has great porosity. It does not have permeability. The pore throats are not connected. So we're looking for the network of connections between pore throats. That's the permeability. So we're looking for large pore throats, but we're also looking for them to be connected. And that's the jar here on your left. So that's the combination we're looking for when we're thinking about storing CO2 in non-oil and gas bearing reservoirs. Okay, I'm going to zoom out from a regional perspective here because I wanted to focus on the Williston Basin for the rest of this geology talk here, next few slides. And so from regional perspective, the Williston Basin encompasses a large portion of North Dakota, a little bit of Saskatchewan, and then Alberta and eastern Montana. Here's an exaggerated cross-section of the Williston Basin, and these are some of the key formations I just wanted to walk through. So North Dakota, Williston Basin is really, it's perfect for the energy development and subsurface that we do today, in the fact that all of our drinking water sources are at where we have the Fox Hills Formation and higher. And below the Fox Hills, that Cretaceous shale is typically 1,000 to 2,000 foot thick shale that's impermeable. So all of our freshwater zones are naturally protected by the shale. And then everything below that shale is either other shales, you start getting into poor quality water, and then you start getting into our oil and gas bearing reservoirs. So we have perfect geology for what we're looking to do and what we have been doing as a state in the subsurface. The next formation is the Inyankara Formation. This has been identified for large-scale CO2 storage, but not necessarily in the oil and gas fields. In the western part of the state, where we have predominant all of our oil and gas development, this formation is used to dispose of all the wastewater that's produced with our oil and gas resource. So we produce well over 1 million barrels of wastewater a day in association with our oil and gas production, and over 90% of that water is disposed of in the Inyankara Formation, and it will continue to be disposed of for a long time. But in the non-oil and gas, in the areas where there's not historic oil and gas production, the Inyankara has been identified for CO2 storage. The primary target today, especially for this first wave of projects, is this Broom Creek Formation. The Broom Creek Formation, you can see it does pinch out. That's good. There's boundary conditions there, and so we're working on continually characterizing this. That's what we'll talk about. But this formation is ideal for large scale storage of CO2. All the CO2 we need to store in the state, plus CO2 from out of state, we can store in this formation for many years to come. And then the last formation that we've identified as a potential storage formation is this Deadwood Winnipeg group. It's actually the lower part of the Winnipeg group is the Black Island Formation as another ideal sandstone that we can see large scale CO2 storage. Actually, north of the border in Saskatchewan, there's the Aquastore project that's been storing CO2 in that formation for quite some time. So another look here at our stratigraphic column in the Williston Basin. So we see the Fox Hills Formation, and everything above this is where our freshwater horizons are. This is where our drinking water, at least our underground sources of drinking water, is found. And then we have the Pierre Formation. This is that Pierre Shale. And then Then we have a series of shales in the Colorado group. And then here we have the Indian Car Formation. Again, this is a good sandstone, but it's also capped by the Skull Creek and the Maori, and below the Swift Formation. So we have shale, sandstone shale, right? We need to cap our injection zone with good cap rocks, with good, we'll call confining zones. Injection zone, it's got upper confining zone, injection zone, lower confining zone. Again, same thing here with the Broom Creek. Our Broom Creek Formation is overlined by the Minnetonka Formation and the Opeechee. And actually in the transition, just on the top of the Broom Creek, it's really good. Sometimes we see a good anhydrite established. That's a really good impermeable rock lithology to ensure that the CO2, because when you inject the CO2, it's buoyant in the subsurface. So you want to make sure you have a seal on top. And then again, same thing with the Black Island Deadwood. So we're seeing that pattern, right? Shale, sandstone, or confining zone, injection zone, confining zone below. And then we also have formations in the Williston Basin that are ideal for CO2 and EOR, and taking that CO2 and utilizing it to enhance soil recovery. When we do that, when we inject CO2 into an oil-bearing reservoir, the way that works is the CO2 will absorb into the rock, and that rock that's oil-bearing, the oil in place, and when it comes in contact with the oil swells, and it becomes mobile. So you're able to produce oil using CO2 that you could not normally produce. It's the technology, it's enhanced recovery technology. So we need CO2 to produce more oil. And so that's the long-term state vision, is we want to manage our carbon dioxide. We want our energy industries to thrive, and we want to utilize our carbon dioxide in our oil fields. Long-term vision is the Bakken. That's the big prize. For every 100 barrels of Bakken that are in place, we produce 10, okay? So we have a lot of oil that stays in the ground at current technology at the primary production phase, and we see CO2 as being able to increase that recovery factor, okay? Okay, geologic characterization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Broom Creek. So through the Peak Corps partnership, we identified this Broom Creek formation as, oh, this looks really good. We can store a lot of CO2 in there, but we didn't have a whole lot of direct data in the Broom Creek other than well penetrations for oil and gas exploration that were just drilled through it, where they would log, but no core data, and some other testing. So in 2017, so less than 5 years ago, we started collecting direct data from the Broom Creek Formation. Prior to that, there was one well, it's called the ANG well. It's American Natural Gas, and it was drilled. It's a disposal well for one of our electricity generation units in Beulah, North Dakota. And there was core. They cored that rock in 1982. And so we had one Broom Creek core, but it was that well was drilled not under the Oil and Gas Division, which has rules for all the core in the state goes to the core library. It was drilled under the Department of Health. So that core was this infamous core that was somewhere to be found. And when I worked for the state, I had a little piece of that core in my office, and I carried it around with me everywhere I went. Well, maybe not everywhere, but I carried it around with me. It was this old kind of dirty core where the sand would be falling off of it, and it had been handled for so long that it was kind of dirty looking, and it had like black magic marker on it that would tell you the depth it came from, and it was from the AG well. So in 2017, we leveraged some federal dollars through the Carbon Safe program. This is the North Dakota Carbon Safe program. You guys here have the Wyoming Carbon Safe program. And we started, we had some federal money, and we started drilling and just scientific wells to core and collect data from the Broom Creek. And so in 2017, we collected our first core from the Broom Creek. And oh man, we're the geologists excited, right? Like they finally got rock, right? And they wanted to see this rock so badly, okay? So that's the beginning of the story 5 years ago. Today we have collected over 10 different cores from the Broom Creek in various regions in the basin. Don't add that up because that doesn't add to 10. There's other ones that aren't on here that are still kind of being drilled today. But we've collected a lot of core in the Broom Creek over a short period of time. And today when we get the core, it's like, oh, I gotta look at another Broom Creek core, you know, because they're all the same, right? We're looking at, these are really, really good sandstones, and we're not seeing a whole lot of different from one area to the next. There's a difference in thickness, but in terms of properties, they're really high quality properties, really good porosity and permeability, and we continue to core, because right now, we went from really not having any core or any testing on these formations to now all of a sudden in 5 years, we're starting to have a really strong regional understanding. And this is driving projects. There's confidence now in this formation to make investment, okay? It's a really important part of of what we're doing and advancing CCS. Okay, ensuring we can do this activity and we can do it in a way that ensures safety and protecting the environment. Okay, so I just talked through the geology. Geology is key. You need the right geology, and after that, it comes into the way you construct your wells. Okay, so this is the engineering component. Okay, so you drill a well in North Dakota. You're drilling into below all your freshwater zones into that good shale, and you got to get into that shale. The rule is 50 foot or more. And then you run a steel casing string, and then you cement that to surface. So that's your first layer of protection. All your freshwater zones are now isolated. And then when that cement sets up, you come back in and you drill through the rest of you drill through the cement, you drill down to your injection zone, you run another steel casing down to that injection zone, and then you cement that to surface. So now you have cement, steel, cement, steel. And then when you go to configure your well and operate it, you run another string of steel, your tubing, your injection tubing, and you run that down into an isolation packer that isolates the injection formation from the rest of the wellbore. So you can actually monitor the space in here. It's the annular space between the tubing and the casing, okay? So if your tubing fails, your first indicator, and you're continuously monitoring this, you'll see pressure on it, okay? If you're operating or injecting. Now in the CO2 storage world, we adjust our well core construction a little bit to address the potential corrosive nature of CO2. Now keep in mind, CO2 by itself is not corrosive. Dry CO2 is not corrosive. When you add water to CO2, that's where you enter the corrosive nature of it. Okay, so if you have dry CO2, you can use standard oil and gas tubing that you would use for any other sort of injection activity, just steel tubing. But when you get into the injection horizon, where this formation contains low quality water, contains water that's the threshold is 10,000 dissolved solids or 10,000 TDS milligrams per liter. The Safe Drinking Water Act kind of puts that's the threshold. So anything less than 10,000 TDS is considered underground sources of drinking water. Anything more is considered poor quality water that we can use for waste disposal activities, for CO2 storage activities, things like that. Okay, so that's kind of the threshold that we got to hit. And we got to find out formations that are poor quality water. Basically, it'll never be used for human consumption today or in the future, because there's better water sources, there's cleaner water sources available. So today we construct our wells for CO2 with CO2 resistant materials right in the injection zone. So here, for instance, you'll see some of these first commercial wells have chrome casing that goes above into the upper confining zone, into the injection zone, and then you'll have CO2 resistant cement behind that. So we're dealing with the corrosive environment. And then the isolation packer here that isolates the formation in it to the annular space, that will be a CO2 resistant material as well. So anywhere where there's potential contact with corrosive environment, we adjust the wellbore construction accordingly. Okay, so this is a class 6 injection well. That's kind of what I just walked you through. Okay, but it's not just a class 6 injection well. This is the Safe Drinking Water Act's underground injection control program standards for all injection wells. Okay, so this just happens to be a well that's injecting CO2 for storage. It's a class 6 well. There's classes 1 through 6 today. And I'll talk a little bit about that history so maybe you understand it. But first, so the whole premise of the program is rooted in protecting underground sources of drinking water. So that's how we construct our wells. But it's not just in the injection control program. This is how we construct our oil and gas wells as well. When we drill an oil and gas well, we protect our near surface environment too. Same concept. We're just a little bit different wellbore construction to produce fluids as opposed to injecting. And I already talked about the specialized materials that we're using with the CO2 resistant casing and cement. And I already talked about the 10,000 TDS threshold. So it's the water that's in the formation, the poor quality formation water. Okay, now we're gonna get to my favorite part. So tying the geology to the engineering together with the policy. Okay, because they work together. The policy and the regulations are tied to the geology and tied to the engineering. That's how things work. So I mean, I talked about that a little bit in the beginning of my talk. So what I realized pretty early on was, oh, the people writing the regulations and writing the policy are geologists and engineers. Well, that makes a whole lot of sense once you get into it, right? I guess I just never realized that, right? So there needs to be that deep understanding of these sciences in order to write good policy to protect things, but also enable the business activity. All right, let's talk about the incentives today. So in the US, there's a tax credit available. It's called the 45Q. 45Q is just a section of the IRS code, okay? And that tax credit is available for capturing CO2 and injecting that CO2 for long-term storage, or utilizing that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. Today, it's a 12-year tax credit. There's a start of construction date that's less than 4 years away, January 1st, 2026. That is driving activity, okay? It's a $50 a ton payout for saline storage. That's what we've just been talking about. Or a $35 a ton for CO2 enhanced oil recovery, where you're storing the CO2 in association with your oil and gas production. On top of that, what we're seeing is these low carbon fuel standards markets be established. The first one to be established is in California, and it's the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And what you're seeing there, so that's for the ethanol industry or the biofuels industry, with they're creating their product, they're shipping it to California, and it's being blended in refineries. And there's a low carbon fuel market that if they capture their CO2 or they have a low carbon intensity fuel that they produce, and it's blended with the fuels in the refinery process in California, there's a really good market for it right now. It's almost $200 a ton for CO2 for low carbon intensity fuels. Okay, so that is accelerating things. There's a lot of the activity we see today that I talked about, that spaghetti mess in the Corn Belt, with all the ethanol plants that want to capture CO2 and transport that CO2 via pipeline to the ideal geologic basins. That's driving it. Okay, and we have a project in North Dakota, or 2 projects in North Dakota that are a part of that as well. On top of that, North Dakota, I'm sure similar to Wyoming, I just don't know, Wyoming has enacted a lot of tax incentives for capturing the carbon dioxide off of a coal electricity generation unit and utilizing that carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery. That is a big part of the state's future vision for carbon management. We want to take anthropogenic CO2, especially from North Dakota, but also from out of state, and we want to inject it to enhance our oil recovery. We have a great resource in the Williston Basin, and we want to maximize that resource. Okay. The 45Q tax credit has been around for many years. Okay, it's not a new thing. What's new about it is in 2018, they amended the code. Okay, and they amended it in a way to incentivize this activity. Well, 2018 didn't trigger a whole bunch of activity, and the reason behind that is because there was uncertainty with the amendments. The industry today that's investing in these projects in 2018 didn't have the certainty they needed to make their investment. So in 2018, what you saw the code get amended, but then you saw the IRS come out with guidance that solidified what it meant to start construction, and then the IRS followed that with a rulemaking. And once those rules became effective, they went through the process where they took public comment, and then those rules took effect. That's what triggered the activity today. There's that, when we talk about, there's the certainty. So companies know today that if you make the investment, because there is upfront investment, that if you make that investment, they have certainty to know that if they make that investment, they can get the 45Q tax credit. No one was going to go after it if they couldn't get it, right? So that's the driver. Okay, I like this slide. It's not mine. I borrowed it from a colleague, but I think you could look at this, and it's called North Dakota's leverage. I think you easily put Wyoming's leverage in there, because we're one and the same with all these items. Okay, Class 6 primacy. Both North Dakota and Wyoming have Class 6 primacy. We both have existing CO2 pipeline infrastructure. Now Wyoming just passed a law for long-term liability. Okay, that's an important piece. Maybe I'll talk a little about that. And then we both have pore space laws, where we identify who the pore space owner is and how you can use their pore space for storage. And then we both have successful carbon safe programs, and we both have statewide visions to manage our carbon. So that's why, I want to make this connection between North Dakota and Wyoming, because it's there. And I think a lot of our state leaders see that. Long-term liability law. This law was put into effect in North Dakota in 2009. Wyoming just passed it. Nebraska passed something similar. Utah just passed something very similar, where 10 years after a company is done injecting, they've stopped injection, they're monitoring a closed site, they can be released of liability. Without that long-term liability law, companies are on the hook forever. And if you know anything about industries and any companies, they don't last forever. So North Dakota has the mindset of, well, as long as you can demonstrate that this site is closed and it's safe and nothing's going to happen with that CO2, that it's going to stay exactly where you put it, we will release you and let you go, and we will take on that liability. But they don't do it for free. There's a per ton fee of CO2. There's a per ton fee for every ton of CO2 injected in North Dakota goes into a long-term trust fund. And so at the end of the day, the state will have multi-million dollars to monitor these closed sites as if they and when they allow a company to be released of liability. Love to answer questions on that because I don't want anyone to be confused on that. Okay, I love this stuff. This is the policy stuff. So at the bottom left corner is our oil and gas statute. Most, if not all states have a very similar language or something like it, where it's in the public interest to foster and encourage and promote the development of our natural resources. We want to maximize recovery. We want to protect collaborative rights. We want to not allow waste of our resource. Okay, these have been put in place for 40, 50 years. Okay, anytime a state begins oil and gas production, North Dakota was in the 50s. I think the statute was enacted in the 60s. They'll have something like this. Okay, this is not new. The way North Dakota regulates CO2 storage is very similar. That's what I'm trying to draw the line to. The CO2 storage statute was enacted in 2009. And look at the comparison there. It's in the public interest to promote geologic storage of carbon dioxide. Doing so will benefit the state. Doing so will help ensure the viability of the state's coal and power industries. Carbon dioxide is a valuable commodity. Our pore space is a resource. Our pore space is a resource. Our oil and gas is a resource. We're using the same philosophy to regulate these activities, and we're seeing it's effective. Okay, so we have an oil and gas agency that's regulating both mineral development in the state and CO2 storage in the state, and they're regulating CO2 storage in a way that they're applying the resource management framework to. I hope that makes sense. I'd love to talk to anyone about that if you have questions, because it's a really important piece, especially for the industry we see today. They can see that, they can understand that the investment decisions they make today, these policies are important to that. Okay, talked about Class 6 primacy. North Dakota and Wyoming are the only two states that are agreeing. I think we'll see Louisiana. The question is when. Louisiana has applied for primacy. So this is the underground injection control program. Classes 1 through 5 have been around since the 80s. So the Safe Drinking Water Act was established, and then through that, the underground injection control program was established. And then in 2010, EPA came out with Class 6 rules. So that's where you had states had to apply for that authority. North Dakota did, and it took 5 years. Wyoming did, it took about 2.5. So it's getting better. But this is really important. We talked about the 45Q tax credit. We talked about regulatory certainty. We're seeing Class 6 primacy start to developing projects. Companies are choosing where they want to develop their projects based on who has primacy. I see it sometimes on a weekly basis. So we see that as a very important piece to the puzzle. And because of that, spend some time through the P4 partnership, but also just because of my experience talking to Montana, Colorado, Utah, Nebraska. I spent some time with them. I spent a lot of time with Louisiana before they applied, and Alaska, which we did that thing. I've been spending time with the Alaska folks because of the P4 partnership, and they hate this right here, putting Alaska down where Mexico belongs, right? So I try not to do that now since I heard something from them. So anyway, very important piece of the puzzle, Class 6 primacy. The difference between going to a state regulator for this activity, finding out, okay, what do you want from me to get approval? The difference between that going to a regional EPA office. The state regulator is the expert of the state. State regulator understands the state, they're expert in the state. That's why that's an important piece. Okay, so through the P4 partnership, we spend time with our regulators. We engage our regulators on a regular basis. We meet once a year in Deadwood, South Dakota is a typical spot. We've been doing this for about 15 years now. And where we have discussions with our regulators about Porous Space law and long-term liability and Class 6 primacy. Those are the 3 keys. Porous Space, identify who owns the pore space, what are you gonna do about long-term liability, and Class 6 primacy in the US. Those are the 3 keys. But today, because we have North Dakota and Wyoming, we're focused on regulatory program implementation, pathways to permit approval, and policy and regulatory barriers. We've moved on, right? Now we're working on deploying this technology, deploying this activity, and we're working toward these different pathways. How do you implement the program now? And because of that, we have a lot of interest from the states I mentioned: Alaska, Montana, Utah, Colorado, Nebraska. And they come to this meeting because they want to hear from North Dakota and Wyoming. All right, I'm going to talk about permitting. If people's eyes start glazing over, I'll just stop and start skipping things. But permitting is very important to this activity. Again, project developers want to see that certainty. They want to know that if they invest in drilling a well and coring, and maybe even constructing a well, that if they do everything correctly, if they have the right geology, if they construct their well properly, that they'll be able to get approval in a reasonable amount of time. And I'll talk about that timing. The permit approval timing is really important. North Dakota developed a system where we look at the storage facility permit as a whole, and that's because we look at it as an area, a project permit, because we have pore space rights to deal with. We have surface ownership. The surface owner owns the pore space, so we got to create a boundary. It's very similar to oil and gas unitization. So let's just kind of compare the two. So in North Dakota, the surface owner owns the pore space. In order to develop a CO2 storage project, we have to have a boundary. So we take all of our site-specific data, we build out a geologic model. The reservoir engineer runs computational simulations. We predict our CO2 plume in the subsurface at the time of permitting. We build a buffer around that. And then from there, we identify the storage facility area, the project area boundary, and everything in there, the pore space needs to be leased up. Okay. North Dakota statute requires there's a 60% threshold. And so after 60%, you can force pool or force amalgamate in non-consenting owners. That might sound scary to some of you in the room. The first wave of projects have all been in the high 90s. They've been able to obtain pore space rights in the high 90%. Now, only a small percentage has been forced in to any of these projects so far. So that's a good sign, right? Very similar to the oil and gas world. So unitization, same thing. You have a common source of supply in an oil-bearing reservoir, and you want to turn that into an oil unit where you can do things like enhance oil recovery. What you do is you have your boundary based on where your oil supply is, your oil in place is. You create that boundary, and then you bring in your mineral owners. You got to get mineral rights to be able to do that. Where you're sharing in the oil production, you have to have 55% in the North Dakota oil and gas world, and then you can force pool the non-consenting owners into those units. Okay, so that's where that comes from. We use the oil and gas analogy, or we've been doing oil and gas utilization for many years. We've applied that to CO2 storage, but different pore space, right? Okay, so we have project-specific permitting. That's the key. After that, then you can go ahead and get your permits to drill and inject, and then you need a permit to operate your well. And at the end of the day, you can get your certificate for project completion. That's that long-term liability piece. I'm not going to go through this, but this is all the data collection to characterize the site based on the requirements, right? So I really like this because you can see up here, we have our major characterization activities where we have to drill wells, we're coring, we're logging, we're doing some downhole testing of the formations, both the injection zone and the confining zone. We're bringing back some of that core and some of that, we're actually testing the fluids in those formations and doing laboratory testing. We're sampling formation fluids and we're doing laboratory testing. We're building out our geologic models with this data, with our seismic data as well. And then we're running our simulations or our predictions and what's going to happen in subsurface once we start injecting CO2. Okay. And then also we're establishing baseline sampling programs and also monitoring that Fox Hills formation that I talked about. Okay, so here's a quick look at what we put together as a permit. Over here, you have the North Dakota Carbon Safe project. This project, the project boundary here, this purple is what was amalgamated. This is the pore space that was amalgamated. That's about 19,000 acres, 30,000 square miles. It's about a 4 million ton per year project at the Milton R. Young Station in center North Dakota. And so what you can see here is the way we put together a storage facility permit. Not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Our strategy there was to make it look a whole lot like a unit application, oil and gas unit application. And then we made the hearing look like that too, where we have landman testify, geologist testify, reservoir engineer testify, petroleum engineer testify. And so that's the order we put these things in. So the oil and gas agency that's used to these unit hearings could see something very similar in CO2 storage. This is our permitting timeline. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. I think I'm running out of time. I want to leave some time for questions. What we've been able to demonstrate is really an 8-month permitting process in North Dakota. And that's really important. In comparison, there's 2 other Class 6 permits that have been issued by the EPA regional office years ago in Illinois. Those are two active storage sites. They took 5 years to issue those permits. So in North Dakota, with the primacy state, we demonstrated we could do it in less than a year. It's really important, and it's driving the activity. So here's the incentive-driven projects. Red Trail Energy is kind of the first. They got permitted in October. They're going to start injection this year. Summit Ag is the one that's capturing CO2 from the Midwest United States and piping that out to North Dakota. They're developing a site right kind of here and in the middle of everything. And you can see the oil and gas fields. So it's interesting because over here east of the oil and gas activity, we don't have to worry about drilling through our storage reservoirs right now. These are in non-productive regions. It's actually coal country in North Dakota. So we have a lot of our coal electricity generation units. And this is where we have great Blue Creek Formation underlined here. Carbon Safe project was permitted in January. That was one of those permits that was issued. And then Bluefoot Ethanol is an ethanol facility co-located with Coal Creek Station. They're developing a CCS project around their site. Again, these are all incentive driven. And then there's another project right here, just north of the Great Plains Fuel Plant. They're constructing a pipeline. They want to store CO2. There's about 1 million tons of CO2 a year, maybe 2 million that are coming off that they want to store for the incentive, for the tax incentive. So we have really good first wave of projects that are all taking advantage of the 45Q tax credit. Red Trail Energy is an ethanol plant that sends their ethanol to the West Coast. So they're also coupling that with the low carbon fuel standard market. Same with Summit Ag, all those ethanol plants in the Midwest United States. Got through it. All right.
Questions?
I have a question. So Kevin, area review can be large. You were showing the Project Tundra area review, and it's quite large. When you're talking about pore space acquisition, do you need pore space acquisition for that entire area review, meaning the whole pressure plume, or are you just focused on the CO2 plumes itself?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, part of the UIC program that I talked about, part of the permitting process is to do an area of review where you're investigating for anything that causes a potential, you're looking for leakage pathways in that upper confining zone. But then the question was also about pore space. What do you need to amalgamate? So the answer to your question is, well, when we amalgamate the pore space in North Dakota, we simulate injection for the life of the project, and then we look at post-injection migration. We're trying to get the plume to stabilize in the simulator. And then from there, so we're just focused on the CO2 plume. We don't look at the pressure front. And from there, we have to draw, North Dakota statute requires a buffer. And so we draw a legal boundary buffer around it. That's why it's all squared off like that. So you can describe it in legal documents. So within this is the plume plus a buffer. The area review, the pressure front is just an evaluation thing. It's just to make sure that, because if you think about it, as you're injecting CO2, you're displacing the water that was there. And so you're causing pressure front, you're pushing formation fluid out. And so we don't want anything out here outside of the plume to act as a leakage pathway to get into the underground sources of drinking water. That's the standard we're trying to achieve.
So North Dakota's been able to do the process under a year. What were the most important things that you did to mainstream that process?
Yes, the question was, North Dakota's been able to do issue these permit approvals in less than a year. And what was the most important thing we did to mainstream that process? The most important thing we did, and this is why I talk about having access to the regulator. We spent a lot of time with the state government, periodically presenting to them the status of the project all along the way, and to the point where we had reviewed some of the draft part of the permit prior to, which then could expedite the process. So we worked very closely with our regulator. When we submitted the permit, they knew about it way in advance, right? It wasn't just dropping a 500-page permit on them and saying, okay, please approve that. We can, So we were able to work with them all along the way. Every step of the way of the project where we were drilling wells, collecting data, it was, let's present to them, let's let them know where we're at.
And did the regulators develop that as a process? Did you have to check in with them periodically, or you were just doing that?
They recommended that.
Questions for Kevin?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about like, so for this sort of mixed use thing where you're doing both CO2 capture and enhanced oil recovery, like what's your ratio there? Like, are you neutral or like in terms of like how much CO2 goes down versus like how much CO2 is potentially going to be released, like at least in the status quo, when those petroleum products are used, produced, burned, whatever happens to them? How does that math work?
So I think what you're asking about, the question was about CO2 enhanced oil recovery and how does the math work in terms of carbon intensity of that.
Correct.
And so that's the question. And what I'd like to just point out a couple things. First of all, there's some reservoir characteristics that would be specific that would need to be addressed.
Sure.
But you got to think about this. It's a closed loop system. So as you're injecting CO2, some CO2 is staying in the formation for storage. Some CO2 is being produced with the oil, with the water, with the gas, and then you're separating things out at the surface and you're re-injecting CO2. So you got a closed loop system there. So that's part of the associated storage system. And then what we see is when we run what's called the life cycle analysis in certain reservoirs, using certain CO2, you can actually have a net negative oil production. And it does depend. I think we see different. So if we're talking anthropogenic CO2, so not naturally occurring CO2.
Right.
So we want to look at different types of CO2, what facility is coming from, and the process when you're looking at the whole life cycle analysis. And we perform those through the P Corps partnership and the work. We've seen some really favorable results. Certainly, it is something that we want to incentivize. It really is. And we want to look at it in a way of storing that CO2 association. Yes.
In North Dakota specifically, do you need more CO2 pipeline, or do you just need like basically connect from other states in order to like be able to meet the the overall state's goal?
Infrastructure is key. So we have this existing pipeline. I didn't talk about it, but it's actually constructed along the Nesson anticline, where there's a lot of our conventional fields. And so actually when they built ports in that. So it's really ideal, but you would need to have extensions off of that to get to our other oil fields. And what we're seeing today is that Summit project is bringing the CO2 pipeline from the Midwest, actually from eastern North Dakota to over. And then down here, I didn't even kind of point this up, Denbury, this is the CO2 pipeline from Wyoming. So it's starting to converge, but in order to do what we want to do, which is wide scale CO2 enhanced oil recovery in the Bakken, we would need more infrastructure. There are existing pipelines. Part of the research we're doing is can we repurpose those pipelines that are maybe a gas pipeline or oil pipeline with CO2 to take advantage of the existing infrastructure.
Right, it looks like we have a class coming in here at 1, so let's thank Kevin again. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.